Excuse me. I don't see anything wrong with that. And you can increase the deposit if they have a pet, but if it's a service animal, you can't.
Richard,
Yes.
how many service animals then a person can have by law?
Depends how many you need.
There is well, there aren't unspecified, there's nothing specified, but the worst example we had that happened to us was 3, and the size of the dogs I quoted was exactly what took place.
Ouch. Okay. Thank you.
How big? And the unit was 1,000 square feet.
Do you remember what was for what?
Richard,
They just stated an
question.
assistance animal, and they're claiming that it was authorized by a physician.
Hey, Richard,
Yeah, but there, if you do come into that, there is a specific procedure that we can follow, not to contest, but to verify the information that they're providing us. Because just as you said, people are having these things printed online, and that's what this one looked like. Also, not that it mattered because it was 20 minutes after the lease was signed, and that's when the tenant notified the listing agent that I have 3 support animals.
Richard, I have one more question.
Sure.
Again, recap on the moving funds. So if somebody's moving in on the 15th of the month, can they just pay the 15 days for the first month
Yes.
and the security deposit? It doesn't have to be 15th to the 15th anymore.
It doesn't, correct. That's changed in this lease agreement. So you're absolutely right. You can just pay for the balance of that month, and then the rent would be due as normal.
Okay, that's a relief.
Yeah, I think it simplifies it. A lot of people didn't follow that anyways, but yeah, I think it's simplified now. And then let's see, the housing providers required to provide the HOA rules and regulations, and actually rules and regulations under section 15A. The housing provider can also provide their own rules and regulations. Well, you could say no holes in the wall. There's an array of things that you can actually put in areas of rules and regulations to prevent them from damaging property. No animals on the floor? It's okay on the couch, right? I saw your dog on the couch, I know.
I'm on my bed.
Oh, yeah. That sounds like most dog owners, right?
Well, out here we have rules that are a little bit different, but one of the main one is no outdoor music permitted.
Oh. Is that the common interest disclosures or the HOA rules and regulations?
It is a city wide ordinance now that if it's a rental property, that you must state that there's no outdoor music. It was driven for the short-term rental properties, and to make it nicer for people in the neighborhood, that people don't come in for a weekend and blast the music.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good ordinance in my opinion. It'd drive me nuts. So then also in regards to the number of keys, devices, so on and so forth. And then the access to the property. So something that comes up quite often, when can a landlord theoretically access the property? Well, the lease gives the landlord and the law gives the landlord the opportunity to give 24-hour notice or more to access the property. And why would you do that? If there's some type of emergency, typically repairs, things like that. Photographs and internet advertising, it puts a tenant on notice. If the property is being shown, somebody else may be taking pictures and disseminating that on the internet, and there's nothing you can do about it. And there's nothing we can do about it. And then also signs, the tenant's authorizing the housing provider to put up a for sale or lease sign. And then assignment and subletting. The tenant cannot assign their interest in the lease or sublet the lease to anyone without the landlord's consent, and the landlord has no obligation to grant that consent. And if the consent is granted, the tenant, the original tenant, is still obligated on the lease in the event the person who is the subtenant breaches the lease agreement. We're getting close to the end. You don't mean that.
Richard, little question.
Yeah, what's that?
When let's say there's a group of students that they get the property rent into 2 or 3 people in their contract, and they change students in certain time of the tenancy. Is that a sublease, or is it okay if you bring more people to after you sign the lease?
Well, if the landlord consents to it, it's fine. Landlord has no obligation to consent to it, and whomever else wants to be added to the lease or released from that existing lease agreement, it requires a consent of the landlord. And then the landlord is entitled to review the assignee's credit. So the person who wants to move in, they don't have to grant it. Then actually another aspect of the lease agreement, I forgot to mention, if a tenant has children and that child turns 18, well, the landlord is entitled to review the credit of that 18-year-old and obtain a credit report, by the way. As a matter of fact, the lease agreement states that the landlord is entitled to credit authorizations and applications on anyone that's 18 years of age and older. Now, that could be discretionary on behalf of the landlord.
But what can you do with that? Can you-
That's a good question. It's just in there. Is there something that's adverse about this individual settling now that he's an adult? Maybe he didn't see his criminal record before, but now it's public record. Do I want him in there?
You can give them out, the whole family, because you have a criminal.
Well, no, you might be able to not kick out the family, but not allow that person to remain in the premises. That individual. Yes.
I came across the same situation, but what I did, I mentioned on the contract, $200 for one person, whoever comes in the property, like for example, if you have like your brother, the kid, have baby, whatever it is, you have to pay $200 extra for your rent.
Yeah, the problem is that very well could be a violation of the Tenant Protection Act now, is increasing the rents and the percentage of the increase. So that's something that's frowned upon at this point in time, but I understand why. We're going to have more wear and tear on the property.
If they sign it, they agree to.
Well, if it's void by law, then it's unenforceable. You can get them to agree to anything, but if the law doesn't support it. Is it? Yeah, I don't doubt that. And then this is something Carlos brought up before, right to pre-move out inspection and repairs. So theoretically, the tenant's entitled, not theoretically, contractually, tenant's entitled to correct any deficiencies on the property themselves. Save themselves some money. But how do they know what is deficient? Well, they're entitled to a pre-move out inspection no sooner than 2 weeks before the expiration of the lease. If they decline, then fine, you go forward with the inspection. But you must offer. And then you find out what the deficiencies are, give them the opportunity to correct those deficiencies. They have an obligation to tell you what was performed by them, give copies of receipts. If they have third parties doing the work, that individual is supposed to be licensed and insured, and they're to provide invoices from those third parties that perform the work. Yes.
Out inspection form.
I understand.
Out inspection form to the tenant 2 weeks prior. Because I was just filling it in and it specifically tells the dates. So like it's spelled out here. So when do we give a pre-move out inspection?
No sooner than 2 weeks before the expiration of the lease.
So we already not representing the landlord.
I understand what you
So
mean.
this is just a favor.
I think it's a
by us giving that form to the tenant, is it bringing us into the transaction?
I think that's a good question. I haven't come across a case with that yet, but we certainly don't want to deliver it directly. Give it to the landlord. Landlord chooses to send it.
Same this renewal, like I provide renewal form to my clients. It's not bringing me back into the transaction.
Put your names on the bottom of the form. Yeah. Now, I understand what you're saying. Could somebody name you? I guess it's possible. Is it a service we want to provide our clients? I'd
Can
say
we
yes.
White out our name?
What?
Can we just white out our name and everything?
You can. Are you going to email it to the landlord? Okay. I was just curious.
So Rich, many years ago, when I rented out a place and they didn't give me my full deposit. They never gave me a notice of right to inspect the property
Uh-huh.
prior to moving out, so I ended up getting 3 months rent for that.
There you go. They probably didn't give you something detailing the deductions they made from the rent out.
They didn't even give me the notice of right to inspect the property, and that's
Yeah.
really messed up.
Yeah.
Because
That's just the beginning.
Yeah, notice right to inspect the property.
Because realistically, if you're the landlord and now the tenant moved out and now you go through and do the walkthrough and you've come across all these deficiencies, do you really want to let the tenant back in the property to correct those deficiencies? No, give them the opportunity before they move out. To put yourself in a better position so you're not paying Carlos 3 times the rent as a penalty. Oh, God.
Complicated thing.
I'm not sure what to say about it. I'm not the one who drafts these things, I can tell you that. And then if there's a breach of contract, that is the one exception for the pre-move out inspection. If the tenant breaches the contract non-payment, for example, you have no obligation to give them right to a pre-move out inspection. Okay? So if there's a breach of the agreement, or maybe they have a dog in the property and they're not supposed to.
Early termination is also.
Yes, if they terminate the contract prematurely. And-
They can move out, like sometimes they say, oh, it's a 1-year lease agreement, but now 6 months into it, they're just causing a lot of nuisance, and the landlord's like, you know what, move out, and I will release the house.
Mhm.
And so they're not entitled to a move out inspection at that point.
If it's a mutual agreement, why wouldn't they be? Are the landlord and tenant both signing something stating we're going to terminate the lease now instead of 6 months in the future when it was scheduled to terminate?
Yeah.
Yeah, if it's mutual termination, then that's a different situation. So today you and I decide I want you out tomorrow and you agree. Well, I'm going to give you an opportunity at that point in time, but maybe I knew nothing about it until today. You just came in and said, I want to get out of my lease with you, Richard. I guess the timeframes would dictate that.
If tenant breaking the lease and negotiate this, like telling the landlord, I want out, and landlord, get out. Do they need to sign something?
Yes.
Or like what?
Well, actually, a mutual termination of a lease agreement. There's a power form that will address that.
Okay, and there is a form,
There is.
and do they need to be agree about deposit or?
Yes, it addresses all of that. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a mutual agreement in terms of the termination.
But if the tenant just give a notice, I'm moving out.
Well, once they move out and turn the keys over, theoretically, that's when it's deemed to have been terminated. But the lease still continues on.
Okay, so for the landlord, it's better to collect damages if tenant just moved out.
I would think so. I just want them out. That would be my approach if it's going to be a problem. I personally have an unlawful detainer action going back to November of last year. I don't have a case number assigned. I don't know, because they've avoided service. Everybody's so smart. They watch all these television shows, right? So then they don't answer the door because it's personal service. Yeah. So that's what you face. It's never beneficial for the landlord, right? Right, Shweta?
Something I do
You know too much. Insurance, you should request or in the contractually mandate that the tenant carry insurance. So that's something that should be in here. I would want at least $300,000 to $1 million in coverage. Liability coverage. You can. You can. And then tenant estoppel certificate. The tenant is obligated to provide or complete a estoppel certificate. If, let's say, for example, the landlord is selling the property or they're refinancing the property, all it does is validate the terms of the lease, the expiration date, the monthly payments, the deposit. So it makes a determination if a lender could rely on that document in the event the landlord is refinancing the property. And then if the tenant doesn't respond, this is not something new in here, then the contract states that everything the property owner has stated is correct. Very interesting. And then we talked about tenant representation obligations regarding occupants and credit. And this is a section about someone who turns 18 and their obligations. We won't go into mediation at this point in time, but this is the next is very important, attorney's fees, section 36. So if there's a dispute between the parties, and assuming it's not exempt from mediation, in what could be exempt, small claims, for example, the attorney's fees to be awarded to the prevailing party are only $1,000. It's nothing. You can change that, however, most people don't. And from one perspective, maybe it's a good reason to leave it low, because if the tenant sues the landlord and nothing has changed here, they're not entitled to recover more than $1,000, assuming they prevail. But if we look at the guarantor section, there is no limitation in regards to what the guarantor may have to pay if there's litigation. And if there's a guarantor, and there's a signature block for that, the landlord can just choose to go directly against the guarantor, and there's no limitation in regards to recovery, attorney's fees, and costs. Very interesting, yeah. You have to. And then under section 38, these are questions actually that are addressed in the seller disclosure. So you can just fill that in accordingly in many cases. And then let's say, time is up, the essence termination of agency relationship. Theoretically, if the contract is negotiated in a different language, the contract's supposed to be in that language. I don't know where we would get the contracts. And then under the section of signatures, many times we use an RC, a representative capacity signature disclosure for purchase contracts or subsequent addendums. Just like the RPA is designed now, you don't have to when signing this document. It actually has fields for the person who's signing on behalf of the entity, if that's the case. And then if there is a guarantor, we have checked the box and insert the name of the guarantor. Now, if the landlord ever accepts an applicant and that applicant doesn't really qualify under the landlord's criteria, but they go forward based upon a guarantor's credit, then you may have an obligation for any future credit evaluation to accept a guarantor. So keep that in mind. If you were to accept a guarantor, I would never accept somebody who's located out of state. Good luck chasing them down. Yeah. And then signatures by the housing provider and the property manager, if there is a property manager, can also be deemed to be the housing provider. So they can sign this contract also. All right. Any questions? Oh, I'm sorry, Joanna.
Extension of the lease. Have a guarantee. Does the guarantor need to sign extension?
I would say yes. I would want the guarantor's extension.
Okay, and if I didn't ask the guarantor to sign extension?
Then it's questionable whether or not the guarantor is obligated.
But if you're just making extension based on all previous terms, like keeping all previous terms, the same, then the guarantor.
Yeah, I think with that, the consent is questionable. Because the term that the guarantor agreed to guarantee was for that original term, That may not necessarily limit their exposure, but I think without their signature, it would be questionable.
Richard,
Yes,
could the landlord tell his listing agent that he will not accept tenants that have guarantors?
you can
Okay,
just be consistent.
okay.
Same thing with credit, right? Under 700.
You can specify credit limitations or credit score limitations, but remember, if you decline somebody based upon a credit score, you have to issue an adverse action notice telling them why you decline them. So it's not ideal that we get into that situation anyways, to say your credit score wasn't high enough, because did you apply that same standard to every other applicant?
Hey, Richard, is the rent cap and addendum still current for the
If-
COVID-19?
If the what is now?
The rent cap and just cause addendum is still current for the COVID-19?
The just cause addendum,
RCJC.
the RCJC, is it still, it's actually part of the lease agreement. It's an addendum to the lease agreement, the rent cap and just cause addendum. Is that what you're asking?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, that is applicable. That wasn't due to COVID. Maybe that was partially instigated by COVID, but that's part of the Tenant Protection Act. So that is valid law at this point in time. Did that answer your question, Carmenza?
Yeah, thank you. That's good. Yeah. Just want to make sure that I have to add it up.
Changes at this point would be the change.
I'm sorry, Julian.
If it's two tenants on a lease and only one wants to extend, do we need to remove one? Like it was the boyfriend and the girlfriend and they broke up, now just the boyfriend wants to stay?
Yes,
Or it can be divorced or whatever, so.
you can.
But what if you, when you remember you were taking them, you were counting two incomes?
Mhm.
And let's say they were paying well and everything is fine, but how do you know that if you only keep one, it has gone to full?
Well, whether it's both renewing or the one individual.
One is staying on a
I
property,
understand.
that's the one moved out, so you know he would not even sign.
Well, in either case, the landlord's entitled to reevaluate the tenant's credit once again before extending the lease.
Mhm.
But he may not, in that case, qualify.
Do we have to specify an extension that only one tenant remaining, or as long as just one?
No,
sign?
you should, otherwise the tenant that departed is going to be obligated to the lease agreement. And then there's a question, so if he moves out, she remains, he doesn't want to be obligated to that lease or have that landlord have recourse against him for non-payment, I would assume.
But what's the best, like I'm dealing with a situation now, the guy said, I'm staying, and I'm only looking at 3 months extension, so it's not even a big deal. So if it would be the whole year, I probably would have gone deeper, but for 3 months, but what if he's gonna stop paying within this 3 months?
Yeah, just say that's great, but all the parties to the lease now have to sign the extension.
Okay, what if I'll send the lease and only one will sign?
Then it's not valid.
It's not valid.
Yeah.
So it's better to, and we don't want, and then it will go months to months. If they're not gonna sign it.
Right, well, actually, the lease just terminates whatever the expiration date is, so they have to be out. Unless the landlord accepts money, then it goes to a month-to-month tenancy. And that's gonna take,
I need to explain to the landlord all the details of.
so if the landlord, is it a 12-month lease, the original lease? So if at the end of the 12 months, if the tenant sends in their check and the landlord accepts it, now it is a month-to-month tenancy.
And he would not be able to go after the tenant who moved out and did not.
I would say they would. I don't think anything would change in terms of who would be obligated, because realistically, there's been no notification that the tenant or one of the two tenants has moved out. So I think the presumption is the existing lease itself will prevail, and that would still obligate both of the original parties. Just because if it went month to month and one of them just physically moved out, that doesn't terminate their obligation.
But if it goes months to months, then landlord would need to give 2 months notice.
Correct. 60 days notice to terminate it thereafter. Yeah,
So Rich, what's the most common mistakes or issues that you encountered with leases?
the rent cap and just cause notice.
One more question, if it went into months to months and then they would wanna sign a new extension, you can go back into lease, right? Or you need to do the whole new lease?
I think you, well, that's a good question. I don't think you could. Once it's become a month-to-month tenancy, how do you suddenly say, no, that's not true? After the
Extension,
fact.
You're extending the lease, original lease dated, this extension, expiration date, and you put there.
I would say, yes, you could do that. Could someone contest that at some point in time, just by saying, we didn't sign that until we signed that March. But my month-to-month tenancy began January this year.
Or they can theoretically just add the exclusion in that extension, right? Saying that the second person is excluded from the extension.
Yeah, if
Yeah,
all
makes
parties
sense.
sign, I would
Yeah.
say yes. So I think there's just some inherent issues if you sign an extension well after the fact when they've been making month to month, or the tenancy became a month to month tenancy.
Yeah.
Why not
If
just-
you leave, it's better to re-sign the whole lease.
Well, yeah, I think so. If you want them out, that's the problem. So I think part of the question she's getting to, they only want to be there for supposedly 90 days, and the landlord wants to rely on that. But if the landlord agrees to a month-to-month tenancy, the landlord now has to give lease a 90-day notice, whereas with, sorry, thank you.
Oh, 90.
Oh, glad you're listening. I was just testing it.
Question
How is that?
about, like, in general, the landlord snooze and didn't sign extension when the lease was expiring. Like
Mhm.
3 months down the line,
It expired. I think it's just that simple.
so you just, and you're in a month to month automatically.
You're,
So
yes.
can you go back into the original lease, or you need to sign a whole? new
I would
lease?
suggest to be completely bulletproof, sign a new lease. Sign it for 2 months.
Okay. Sign it for someone that then get 30-day notice? No.
You don't have to give a notice.
Oh, you don't have to give a notice.
Now, the ideal situation would be to extend the lease. Just say, I'm going to extend it 3 months before the expiration. And that way, no notices are required. They just have to move out. Yeah. You see it?
Okay, so on a lease extension, is there any way we could adjust the deposit, to ask for more deposit? In that case, would you be able to encourage them, for example?
Yes, you could theoretically. What if the rent goes up? Yeah, you're still entitled to hold 2 months deposit for an unfurnished unit.
So we can increase the deposit.
You could,
on an
yeah.
extension.
And I would think even if the rent doesn't go up, you might be able to increase the deposit. Maybe. But the other question, I'm always concerned about things. If my original offer to somebody was to say, the deposit you have to pay me is only 1 month, then I don't know if I would deviate from that. Yeah,
In my lease agreement, it says that after 3 years staying in, I can ask for new paint and carpet renewal
mhm.
from the management. And last year, we renewed our lease for the 4th time, so it was our 4th year. And I asked them if they can paint the walls and then renew the carpets, and they said they cannot because our rent is much lower than the new rents. So I didn't say anything. I didn't ask them to do it, but
But does it say you can ask? And if you do ask, do they have an obligation to do it? Or is it just you get to make the request and they can evaluate your request? How's it structured specifically?
I should have checked that again. I mean,
You can bring that in for a real life example.
because otherwise there wouldn't be any thing like that. I mean,
Yeah, I would say that the amount of the rent has no bearing on it, just because they're saying you're paying less rent, because if they obligated themselves,
it depends on the amount of rents.
You would have to say
the
that, yeah.
market rent.
but it doesn't say that.
Yeah.
But if the contract said that the landlord would repaint and scotch and replace the carpet, that's her obligation. Is that the Irvine company?
No, it's RG.
Yeah.
I actually found the only building that is not by Irvine company, Irvine School District.
Okay, any other questions? No, all right. Thank you for coming today, and we will see you next week. Woohoo!
Thank you. See ya.
John, I'll see you Friday.
I was just gonna say that, but I figured I'd let you.
I have to call you so we can figure out the time and things like that.
All right, whenever I'm around.
All right, guys, see you.
Can I have you?